Okay, good morning, good afternoon, evening. Feel like we continue to say that. Hopefully at some point we'll all be able to say a good morning and be on the same time zone as each other. But it's great to have everyone on this call, and thank you for all being with us again today. You should have received the agenda papers for this call, and it was all posted online for the public. And as I said, it's a good reference for everyone, and all our YouTube followers is at the IAASB website. We are a full complement of board members, TAs, and staff this week on the call, and so that's these calls. So that's great, and great to have 100% attendance. As always, wanted to welcome our public observers, and this week for the PIOB we have Michael Haithman. Thank you, and Karen will join us others next week, and of course Jim Dowkin and Yosh Matsumoto from the Japan FSA. So thank you for being with us. If you haven't figured it out, it's a pretty busy week for us here, and we're going to begin with the topic of less complex entities, ISIS or LCEs. We're doing that on Monday, and potentially a short session on Tuesday and Wednesday if they are needed. The hope, the plan, and of course we will follow the direction of this board, is that we will approve an ED next Wednesday. Just assuming that everything goes smoothly, and I don't want to over assume, but if everything does go smoothly, some logistical details. The LCE task force may bring up some updated proposals for discussion on Wednesday. The updated drafted for this discussion, and it would be, as I understand, Kai and Bev, rather limited to a very few items. If we do come back on Wednesday, would be available New York time afternoon tomorrow. Is that correct? If we bring back, and as I said, it will not be the whole thing. The revised draft for approval, the hope is dependent upon how many comments, and we're getting lots of comments right now, which we're trying to process, published on Friday morning. And the LCE task force is going to be available for consultation on Sunday, the 19th of June. So I think you should have received a sign-up link from Amy via email to book a time slot if you'd like to have a call with the task force. The other topics this week one is fraud. And on Tuesday, we'll bring specific matters related to fraud. And Lynn will also explain to us how the fraud working group will develop its project proposal for first consideration in September. On Thursday, Friday, the board will walk through a revised draft of the proposed ISA 600 revised related to group audits. This will include a discussion on the risk-based documentation related to group audits. We'll also discuss the feedback we've received from respondents on the remaining questions, save two to the ED that were not brought to the board in December and March, and then also the task force's approach to those areas. Really good set of papers for this week. As always, I want to thank all the task forces, working groups, staff, anyone who was involved in the preparation of the meeting papers, which were all prepared and on time, and so thank you for that. These are three really important public interest topics, and so it's really important that we have a robust conversation. I wrote a note to you last week just talking about the real goal is to make sure that we have a robust discussion on all the key issues here, and where necessary to really pause when we have differences of view to make sure that we have fully dissected the issue and understand the pros and cons. One other topic would be is to to make sure that editorial comments are sent to the task force work group chairs or staff. That's not to say if you have close calls, of course, raise them. I'd rather err on bringing things to meetings, but again, editorial comments, please limit them to writing to the task forces. Before we start with the meetings discussions, I just wanted to highlight some of our activities in recent times. Since our last full week meeting in April, we published our EER non-authoritative guidance on applying ISA 3000 revised to extended external reporting assurance engagements. We are getting a lot of interest in that topic. It's the #1 topic that we're asked to speak on these days. So really encourage people to do further outreach on that and drive traffic to our website. There's a lot of useful material there. The ED containing the conforming amendment to the IAASB's other standards related to quality management, that comment period closed on May 24th. Our plans to bring changes to the September meeting for final approval in October. IAASB's exposure draft on the definitions of listed entity and PIEs closed on May 3rd. In that ED, there were a number of considerations related to our work, and we are closely coordinated with IAASB on the project. This is a big topic of our discussion in July for our July board meeting, so more to come there. And then another question I often get, and we have an immediate response for this, is when is some of the first time application guides for ISQM 1 and 2 coming out? The answer is today they're coming out. So great work to the team. We will also be releasing an interview, a video interview with Julie and Brandon Murtaugh to help firms think about their initial planning. As you can see, that lots of outreaches happened in this quarter, as always. FER, IOSCO, Forum of Firms, SMPC, and of course our regular, I don't even refer to it as quarterly meetings with PIOB, but regular meetings on a regular basis with the PIOB on all matters related to public interest. We also held our National Standard Center meeting at this quarter. Got great feedback on the LCE, which is feeding into our discussion today at CUSP. We got a report from the Paul Munter of the monitoring group on the current stages of monitoring group recommendations. And I will say that has been a big focus behind the scenes. We've made I think, hit a milestone where we're as much gone from planning to starting to think about transition phase on the monitoring group recommendations. We had seen in our news alert 2 weeks ago that we're about to have 4 webinars on ISQM over June and August. Please promote that. We need your networks. We're doing this to help those involved with the implementation of ISQM. It really will be helpful for us. In that vein, we're hosting, we've also been at a couple of webinars on quality management for the Caribbean region and one for Europe. The European one, which was hosted by World Bank and IFAC, had almost 1,000 participants live on that day. So another sign that people are paying great attention to the QM standards. And where will you find all this information if you're not watching this YouTube video live? Our Twitter account, we're nearly up to 8,000 followers. Let's get to 8,000 maybe by the end of these board meetings. We're over 5,000 on LinkedIn and 824 YouTube subscribers as of today. And if you're doing outreach, remember to let Bev and Hankin know. So a lot is happening. And really the focus now is for one of our key strategic priorities is the LCE standard. And as I said, our hope today is to begin the progression towards an ED to be approved next Wednesday. So one last thing before we turn to that is minutes. You have the minutes for the April and May meetings. The ones for March will be distributed later today. The goal is to approve them on Friday. Get your comments, if you have any, to us by Wednesday. Is that correct? Wednesday is when you want it? So on Friday, we will try to approve them. Okay, let's pause there and ask anyone if they have any comments before we begin today's sessions. I see none. So Kai, everyone seems ready to focus on LCE. So let's go, LCE time.
Thank you, Tom, and thanks for that intro. Hopefully we can live up to the expectations that it will be a great LCE time throughout the week. So thank you all, and I think it's that we've come to this stage on the project that we are on hopefully the final stretch to getting an AD out. It will be a busy week, as you see from the schedule, and as Tom laid out as well. I think we would have benefited from being in the same room, having physical meetings, having more time available. But since there is limited time, we also asked for comments up front. I think we heard from almost everyone, and thank you all for doing reaching out to us to identifying issues up front so that we could get a head start into the week. That being said, if you have additional comments, to send them through by 1 p.m. New York time today, so that we'll be able to work on that starting tomorrow when we have a task force meeting already. So reminding of that. I think leading up to this meeting, the task force met multiple times, and I would just like to take a minute to thank the task force, Julie, Changwei, Roger, Vivian, Brendan, and Chris, for the work being done up until reaching this stage. And also, we would never have been at this point if it had not been for the continued efforts and support and work done from staff, being led by Bev, also Amy, Nikki, Kalina, and Willie, and all the others that have been involved. I think we would never have been there if not the long hours and numerous Zoom calls would have been done. So thanks for all of that. And also for the board, I think if we went back to the start of this project, I think Brendan at one point had a presentation saying keep an open mind. I think we have managed to keep an open mind and been discussing the topics, so we'll be getting back to that throughout the week. So if we get to the next slide. Yeah, we had the discussion on the authority and the piece to go in the explanatory memorandum around groups in May. So I won't elaborate further on that. We will look at the authority piece again, and we will later on in the week also explore more on, or discuss more on the explanatory memorandum. This week we need to focus on the draft standard. We'll do that today. I think given that there is limited time available, we may or may not be able to go through a detailed discussion of the mapping documents later on. So if you have significant issues or fatal flaws through them, that you should raise them when we go through the different parts of the standard itself. In the discussion as well, we will look at the supplements for the authority of the standard, the conforming amendments to the IAASB preface, and as Tom said, we will continue having discussions tomorrow night and also bring back a piece on Wednesday if needed. I think from the comments we received so far, we see that there is a lot of or everyone is highlighting the importance of the explanatory memorandum and the questions to be in there. So we will, as I said, bring back some more of that and have a discussion on topics to be included and also specific questions, so we can come back to that as we go as well. I think the other part that is of crucial importance here is the outreach to be done after an ED is out, since we're seeking input from different stakeholder groups, and also in the regular exposure, we will need to take a minute to discuss some of the outreach plan and the plans we have for how to get that information in. So that's where we'll focus on in this meeting. And when we later on discuss the standard, we'll go through part by part. So please stay as focused as possible in bringing up issues that relate to the relevant part, and we will go through every single one by one. So let's go on to the next slide. Outreach performed since the last meeting. I think the day or the following day after we had our last board meeting, we had a meeting with the National Standard Setter Group. They supported our approach. We basically focused mostly on the authority there. They had support on the approach. They had some concerns on the inconsistencies that could be there if different jurisdictions had different restrictions. They had some questions and around the public interest characteristics, as we've discussed as well in the board. And wanted more clarity on the qualitative characteristics. I think parts of that's already been addressed. I think based on the comments, we may need to do a bit more there as well. We will continue also throughout the consultation period to have discussions with this group and reach out to them. Similarly, we had a meeting with the IFAC SMP advisory group, shortly walking through the standard. They continue to support this project and emphasize the need to get it out for exposure. Similar to some other groups, they continue to be concerned about excluding group audits. I think with the approach we've taken, that's the way we need to go, and that we have a specific part on that in the explanatory memorandum. We also follow up with the reference group, have meetings with them. They continue to support what we do. One interesting thing that they did express is that they expressed concern on the increasing length. I think what they said is that for the last 3-4 months, we almost doubled the length of the standard, and mostly of that being explanatory material. So keeping that in mind as well. PIOB. Staff met with the PIOB and discussed some of the broad issues with the authority. They were supportive of the consistency with the IAASB as we've built it on, but they also expressed caution, and we need to see where IAASB ends out. So we'll continue to do that. PIOB has also issued their new public interest issues on less complex entities. They support the projects of the standard, and but they also see the need for the scope to be sufficiently restrictive, and then so for the correct entities and not including listed entities. They welcome consultation of groups, but they still think that the groups should be excluded. The last 2 bullets here is around letters. We did, prior to the meeting, receive 2 letters, one from IFAC, where they support the work that we're doing. They urge, they say it's an urgent need for us to address this issue and to address the significant risk of fragmentation of the international standard setting, and so that we will stop the development of regional and national standards for this specific group, and they strongly encourage us to issue an exposure draft so that we can hear from the wide range of stakeholders. Similarly, from ICAAW, they also sent a letter supporting the progress and congratulating us for the progress, urging for an exposure draft, but they have significant concerns around not including group audits in the standard. So I think that's a brief summary of some of the outreach that we've done. And most of this is also described in the issues paper, so I won't go more in detail on that. So let's go on to the next slide. This is just to remind us on what we agreed on in the project proposal. We said that we will develop a risk-based standalone standard to provide reasonable assurance to respond to the calls that we have on the discussion paper. The requirements will be based on the concepts of the ISAS, principles-based, and focus on the outputs. The standard will incorporate the core requirements from the ISAS, adapt this as appropriate for an audit of an LCE. So this has been the basis of what we have developed. I think we as a task force think that we stayed true to this, and we've continued to add some more details on as we went through this process based on the input that we got. Again, thank you to all the board members providing detailed comments, both to this meeting and earlier meetings. Some of the comments that we've received for this, we will go through when we talk to the different parts today. But we also need to keep them keep them on the list. So we will discuss with the task force tomorrow. So we'll bring some of that back. I think in the back of our head going through the discussions now, we need to, as I said, try to stay true to these principles and avoid the risk of just adding things to the sake of adding it in addition. So we will dilute some of the things we agreed on by having core requirements from the ISAS. So we can go on to the next slide. When we drafted the standard, this is the proportionality and drafting that we used in developing the standard. This is not new to you, as it's been explained in the issues paper as well. We've included the ISO requirements. Some of them are included in full, some of them are modified to the nature and extent of the ISA for LCE. The outcome is expected to be at the same from our evaluation. We've excluded requirements that are for specifically restricted entities like listed entities and groups. Also excluded requirements to address complex matter and circumstances, as this is not intended for the standard. And also we've excluded requirements from the ISAs that are to address rare or exceptional circumstances that are unlikely to appear in an ISA or in an LCE audit. And this is in line with the project proposal. And also towards the end, I'll just say that we have applied some of the cost drafting principles that were presented in the board the last time. It has been in the appendix 6 to this issues paper. We have the drafting principles. As it says here, we applied where applicable. I think some of it is very helpful, and we try to do that. And I do think we also have some input to feedback to the cost where some of the principles that may look good on paper may be more difficult to use in drafting itself. So let's go on to the next slide. Transition to ISAs. We had mentioned it briefly in the issues paper, but it has come up from multiple sources, a concern not to have more material on the transition from the separate standard to the ISAs. What we have discussed, and we will discuss a bit further with the task force as well, but we intend then to have a bigger piece in the explanatory memorandum describing the transition. Basically helping how you can move from this standard into the ISAs. We will not go in detail having every single point in there, but I think at this point what we will bring back to you and discuss is some of the topics to be included, so we can have further input on that as well. Some of this, as I said, the non-authoritative guide will start out with terms of engagement, as if you have agreed to use this separate standard. This is something that you may have to address, and some of the other items here is also areas where we at this point have seen where there is a need to go back and discuss or to include more material in the explanatory memorandum. As I said, we will have a more descriptive piece on this in explanatory memorandum and also have specific questions there as well. Some of these questions may be if this should be a separate guide or is something that should be included as part of the standard. If there are additional areas that what we have identified that need to be included in these kind of guides, and if there are any triggers that may require the auditors to transition from the standard itself. We can go to the next slide. I think the last time we discussed the standard, we had some concerns on the title of the standard. The task force has gone back and discussed this a bit further. As you've seen from the material for this meeting, we have included a piece for the preface to the IAASB standards to include something on these set of standards. It is an international standard for audits of less complex entities. So we say it's still an ISA in a way. We discussed that it's better not to include it in the ISA series to avoid the confusion, and also to show that it is a separate standard. It's better not to have it in the series of the ISAs themselves. So that's why we kept it as a separate set of standards, calling it the ISA for LCE. It is also something that we need to have a specific question on in the EM. But I think for the purpose of the exposure draft, we need to have an agreement on the name itself. So we think it's still appropriate, and that's what we've been going forward with. So let's go to the next slide. I think at this point, it's maybe worth to go to some general or opening comments from the board. I think I've addressed some of the areas we want to highlight up front. As I said earlier, we will walk through every single part of the standard itself. So when we do the discussions, please try to stay to the point, to the part being discussed. So Tom, maybe I should hand back to you to go through some general and opening remarks from the board.
Thank you, Kai, and for that summary and current state of thinking by the task force. I'll open it up for general remarks about the current direction being proposed by the task force, and we'll save specific comments, except if to the extent that it reflects your current outlook on the proposed ED. Anyone would like to begin? Len.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Kai. Thank you for that excellent overview. I think the task force and the staff have been quite responsive. I think when I left the March meeting, also a meeting we had since the March meeting, I wasn't in the comfortable place, but after seeing what you have done, and also a number of areas that you have addressed the comments raised from the board, and particularly in the authority section, I thought the supplement materials was very helpful. So I'm actually quite comfortable in terms of the direction and the work done so far. But I also want to add that before this meeting, I had participated in several discussion outreach. They range from different jurisdictions, also different spectrum of practitioners from the largest networks, and also some of the small practitioners. I would say that there might be some divergence in views in terms of some of the fundamental questions kind of raised in previous meeting, but one overall consistency is people are supportive of this project to go out. It's such a public interest focus issue. And I had the privilege of listening to the PIOB discussion that you did. And I thought the PIOB members were very supportive of getting this standards out. As a practitioner, I do realize that there might be certain areas that people might have different view, particularly on risk assessment. I think Part 7 risk assessment is central to the scalability of the standard. So I do foresee that we'll be getting a lot of comments in there. But with that in mind, I also stand back and think about that this is not a typical IAASB exposure draft. We were exposing something that the IAASB has never done before. So I would also encouraging myself to perhaps step back a little bit in terms of, we need to be flexible and nimble. And this is such a high priority project that if we look at this ED from a traditional lens, some of us may never be satisfied. So with that, I just want to say I'm pretty encouraged in terms of what the task force and the staff have done, and I look forward to the discussion throughout the week. Thank you.
Thank you, Len. Lynn.
Good evening, everybody, or good morning, and thank you very much. I think that the ISA for LCEs is in a good place. I think it's clear and easy to read, and it flows well. And from my perspective, it should be helpful and useful to people doing those kinds of audits. I'm very pleased you've picked up the transition point up front, because I think it is a significant issue of interest, and putting it in the EM makes sense to me. Most of my comments are minor and I've put them through in writing, but overall well done, and thank you for excellent work. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you, Lynn. Diane?
Thanks, Tom. Hello, everybody. First of all, I want to thank the task force and the staff for all the tremendous work that you've done to get the standard to this step. We've spent some time on it. I just wanted to provide in my opening comments that my principal focus area when I looked at it was to make sure at the end of the day, the standard is written such that the practitioner who follows it will be able to be in a position to provide reasonable assurance. This is not an audit light. This is not designed, at least I hope it isn't designed to create an audit that if that private company or LCE company wanted to go public, additional audit work would need to be done. This is a standard designed to provide reasonable assurance. And so there were some items when I went through the mapping that we did summarize and send over, where we categorized all the items that did not come over to the standard. We categorized them in terms of things that we thought were needed to provide reasonable assurance. It's a small list. I think it's a very manageable list. There was a second category of items where I thought was important for the practitioner, some of it around reporting, where they just may need information in order how to apply it in the standard. But I think I'll be curious as to how, whether those comments were addressed and how it moves forward. But again, my focus, and you'll probably hear me say it a few times if we raise points, it's going to be about, is this guidance necessary to enable the practitioner to provide reasonable assurance? That's probably my number one focus. But again, thank you very much to everybody for the work that you've done so far. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you. Fernando?
Thanks, Tom. Kai and task force, thanks a lot for the hard work. General terms, the feedback I've heard, it's very positive. People are quite happy with the standard. There's a lot of expectation for the exposure draft, and give feedback and comments on the questions. I think practitioners in general terms feel that they have received very helpful material actually to contribute in the way they perform the audits. I believe that this is going to be a critical, very important project for everyone in practice, and we look forward to providing the detailed comments going forward. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Sue.
Thank you, and hello everybody. Like others, I feel that this is very much heading in the right direction. I think the clarity has improved since the previous draft, and the standard is reading in a very straightforward kind of way. And I also feel it's important that this is put into the public domain so that we can address getting some of the perhaps more granular feedback that we need to be able to finalise. In the outreach I did, I got very strong feedback from a number of practitioners who work in this space that this was meeting some of these needs. So I think that's a very positive outcome, and congratulations to Kai and the task force and the rest of the team. The two main concerns that I have relating to groups and transitions, you've picked up in the overview and talking about addressing those in the explanatory memorandum. So I possibly just have a question, Kai, which is at what point we get to see the explanatory memorandum to provide input on. And part of that is because I think it's really important that we ask very clear questions to get the feedback that we need, to collect some of the data that we need perhaps in the group areas about how this will impact take up, and also that we get sufficient input to be able potentially to progress to issuing a final standard rather than having to look at re-exposure. But as I say, overall, I think it's a great job and in a good place. So thank you very much.
We'll come back to how we're going to get feedback from the board on the explanatory memorandum. All I could say is that we talked about this last week, and in the context of being slightly different than other projects we've had, we probably will be seeking for giving you enhanced opportunity to comment on the explanatory memorandum. Edo?
Yes, thank you, Tom. Let me first start with congratulating the task force and Kai, or led by Kai and the staff, for the progress they've made. I think it's starting to look like a polished document. However, I still have a couple of concerns, and I'll pick out a few here, and the others I'll address them when we touch upon them. And it may not be a surprise that I still struggle with the authority or the applicability of the standard. I've said before that I think it's critical that we get this right to be able to result in consistent application in practice, such that an LCE in one territory is also considered an LCE in another territory, or even within territories. I am worried that we're trying to please too much and too many. And the continued discussion on group audits and whether or not it should be included, I think, is indicative thereof. I think the board gave a pretty clear steer on where we were going to be. The authority or particularly the supplemental guide makes it very clear that this standard is not to be used for audits that are a little bit more complex, and in those circumstances, reasonable assurance may not be achieved. So I'm struggled with paragraph 810 that is still to a large extent focused on what is not an LCE, and the criteria discussed in there seem to be rather, or some of them are subjective and very much from in the eyes of the beholder. What's complex for one may not be complex to another, and as a result, that could create divergence. So that's, and I've been thinking about this, why I was concerned about the fact that it's primarily describing what is not an LCE. And I think my key concern resides in the fact that practitioners may seek to just sit beneath that threshold of not being an LCE. And as a result, the whole spectrum shifts closer to the complexer areas rather than to the really non-complex areas. And I think that and I'm concerned about that, because I think that's the tendency where practitioners may lead to if local or regulatory bodies are not reining this in. I struggle to see that all the firms are going to throw away their competitive advantage up front, which means that we're leaving it up to the practitioner to pass judgment on whether this is an LCE or not. Hence my comments on subjectivity and still a risk of a race to the bottom, where entities may shop around to see which firm and which practitioner may accept the use of this standard, maybe under the impression that the amount of work effort would be reduced using this standard. I don't think it necessarily will be, but so that's one of my key concerns. I've also, of course, gone through everything that was being provided to us, and if I stand back from this, I was missing here and there some application material. And at the end of the day, I was just trying to reconcile in my mind that that we've taken the requirements, and I think the task force has done a great job in bringing all those requirements together. I've got a couple of comments here and there, and I think a couple of areas still need to be included, and I've provided that those suggestions offline. But at the end of the day, I'm just still thinking, well, now we've taken all the application material away, or a large extent of the application material away, and we still expect the practitioners to get it right. Without and consistently, since I've been on the board, but also before when I was following the board, there's always been requests for more guidance, more application guidance, etc. So now we're taking it all away, but we're still expecting that this will help the auditors of LCEs undertake consistent, effective, and high quality audits. And I still can't fully reconcile that in my mind, why that is when we take all of our application material away. I understand, of course, the choices between length of the standard and the choices we make in that respect. I'm just wondering here and there whether we're not erring to the length issue a little bit too often. I think those are, and I'll come back on a couple of other topics as we go along the standards, but those are, I guess, are my key items, because I think we will discuss the preface, where I think there's some modifications necessary. And one final comment, I'll make it now, given that we were not supposed to discuss the definitions, but want to ask the task force to do a bit of a completeness check on the definitions. There were quite a few terms used, even complexer terms for practice, that were not in the list of definitions. And I've handed that back to the task force as well. So that's my overall comments. Thank you very much, Tom.
Thank you. Isabel?
Hello, everybody. I first want to congratulate the task force for the amazing work that has been performed. It's absolutely amazing, Kai Morton. To some extent, you made our dream come true. The dreams we had a few years ago when we started with the first Paris conference. However, little by little, we can see the length of the standard increasing, and I've heard some comments on that. So that may be a risk that we will need to consider. And as I often say, le mieux est l'ennemi du bien. So the best is the enemy of the good. And I can see and perceive a risk of over-engineering that standard to satisfy the needs of some, as Edo has said. So we really need to focus on LCE. And I can see the debate that we have currently on group audit as a risk that the standard doubles in volume and in complexity. And that was not the initial intention. So we will have to be very careful to that, to keep the standard focus on LCE. It does not mean that nothing needs to be done on group audit, but maybe not in that standard. And I also wanted to share with you the fact that I did some outreach recently in Belgium with SMP in French-speaking Africa, where most of the practitioners are SMP. And also, of course, I had a lot of contacts in France, and there's a lot of support and a lot of enthusiastic expectation about the standard. So really happy to work on that and expect that we will be able to finalize it for VED next week. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabel. Wendy.
Okay. Thank you, Tom. I too want to congratulate the task force. I'm once again awed by the efforts, the outreach, the responsiveness, in tracking this for me in my short lifetime on this board. And it's amazing where we've come. I think we have on balance, and I had to step back many times and say, I have to look at this holistically. On balance, we're definitely headed to the right place. I look forward to some of the debates that we're gonna have this week. I am not so focused on whether, the challenge of an exposure draft or re-exposing. I liked what Isabel said about group audits, because I was struggling with that a bit. I do think you can have less complex group audits, but then in putting it in the standard, it will make the standard much longer. And also, we're working through a new standard for ISA 600. So I question whether or not we want to spend the time to put it in this standard only to have to update it very shortly. So I got getting comfortable with excluding group audits. My main focus is in two places, how we word and what the questions are for the explanatory memorandum. So as others have mentioned, when do we get to see that? And the key area for me in terms of the exposure draft itself is the concept of reasonable assurance. Is the opinion the same reasonable assurance that we get in the full ISAs? I think it has to be. We all have to agree on that. And so most of my comments are in the reporting area to make sure that reasonable assurance is achieved. The one area that I'm struggling with just a little bit is whether or not the intent is for the practitioner using this standard to also be familiar with the full set of ISAs. And so for me, I find myself going through I go from the details back to my holistic approach. And I find myself trying to balance whether I know what to do in this area because I know the full set of ISAs, or the standard itself is complete enough. So I will listen to the discussion this week so I can come to closure on that. And then I just want to touch a little bit on the point that Ido made about the divergence or the flexibility in countries and between firms, and will that really detract from serving the public interest in a high quality audit? And in the end, I got comfortable with the authority because a little bit we struggle with that already in the full ISIS. So that's not a real detracting focus for me. And at this point, that's all I have to add. Really awed by the work done by the task force and the staff. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. Josephine?
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Again, another person here to say congratulations, huge congratulations and thanks to Kai, the task force, Bev and staff for all the hard work here. I note Wendy's comments about the responsiveness. I am particularly appreciative of a number of amendments that have come through the standard in response to some of the comments I raised at the previous board meeting. So thank you so much for that. Similar to Ado, my focus is on making sure that we have got the authority right in the sense that the task force and to some extent the board are making decisions on what requirements are appropriate for the standard, what objectives are appropriate for the standard on the basis of the information that we have in the authority. And so when we come to that, I'll comment on some areas of change I would like to see there to tighten that up a little bit. I still have some comments on the requirements, particularly absent those, to Diane's point, that I feel are necessary to obtain reasonable assurance and also to encourage consistent application of the standard. I have comments on other aspects of the preface and authority. We are going to cover the maintenance, but I would like to talk about that as well. But on the whole, really pleased with the direction that the standard is heading in. I'm sure as we talk through these issues this week, we can get to a very comfortable place. Just because it was raised, I wasn't expected to be raised, I would just like to say that I do remain comfortable with the decision on the board in respect to groups. I do not think it's appropriate to deal with them in this standard, particularly given with the level of entities that we're dealing with. But again, I do absolutely support the idea of raising that in the explanatory memorandum. That's it from me for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Kaioi?
Hello, everyone. Good to see you all. So the draft standard has improved significantly since the last meeting. And I will congratulate Kai, the task force, and the staff for the work you have done. It's great. However, there are a good number of issues where I believe the draft can still be improved. I will address some of these in the meeting and have sent them offline. I have concluded that publishing an exposure draft at this stage might lead to better quality feedback. So I'm in favor of issuing a standard, even if the draft may not be as mature as our exposure drafts normally are. Thanks, Tom. I'll give back to you.
Thank you. Eric.
Thank you, Tom, and congratulations to the task force and staff for all the amazing work that's been done. Like others, in talking to people in this space, they like the approach to the standard. They find it easy to follow. They like the way that the standard works through the audit and finds that a very practical approach. I think that we're getting close. I think the main areas of concern at this point from the people that I've spoken with are around transition and moving in and out of the standard. Somewhat like where Edo is coming from, I think there's some challenges for practitioners, particularly in situations where, 1 year there might be a particularly complex area, and the next year that complexity is gone. Does that mean we have to move in and out of the standard, depending on those kind of circumstances? And while I think the explanatory memorandum may be able to explain some of those concepts and what the thinking is of the board in that respect in terms of putting boundaries around the use of the standard, I think it really does need to be in the standard itself. And so I'm hoping that as we go through some of the discussions this week, we do reach sort of consensus on what the intent is in some of these more pragmatic areas, recognizing that we can't cover everything, and that we do need to get the draft out for comment. So I sort of sympathize with some of Sue's views that some of these might be granular views, but some of them are pretty critical from my perspective in terms of whether people will use this. They need to know this before they will be able to commit one way or the other to using the standard. And I think that's an important thing that the board needs to understand is, will this standard be used, and will it be used in the right circumstances? So we need to be clear on that. You know, I have a number of comments as we go through various areas of the standard, and I'll come back to those at a later time. But I think that was probably the most critical point from the work that we've done so far. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Imran. We can't hear you, Imran. It doesn't seem like your audio is connected. Maybe you could log off, come back on. I'll go to Jim and then we'll come back to you.
Thanks, Tom. And while the CAG has not met since these revisions have been made, I think I can speak on behalf of the CAG, which has been generally very supportive of the LCE. And just in my review of the document, what really helped me was the authority table and chart, and I think that may alleviate some of the concerns that had previously been brought up by CAG members. So thank you, Kai, and your team for doing that. And then secondly, I still think maybe a little more discussion on 315 would be helpful, but I would say overall, I believe that the CAG would be supportive of the direction of this, and wow, you've come a really long way in a very short period of time. So thank you.
Hi, great. Imran, have you rejoined? As we speak. Okay. Anyone else like to speak in this section? We've got it almost everyone. Imran?
Yes, I'm back.
Yeah, we can hear you now. Yeah.
Thanks, Tom. What I was saying is that it's I really wanted to react firstly to some of your opening comments. Months before meeting passed very quickly, and you, in your opening comments, reflect a lot on what has happened in respect of outreach in that time. For someone who is geographically so far away from other members of the board, I really appreciate very much all the efforts that you described. We appreciate that you described them as single events, but behind them, there is just an enormous amount of staff time and staff activity and board member time and board member activity. So really grateful for it. My own experience in needing support for outreach has been that the staff work has been phenomenal in the area of QM, and it's really made it easy for us to respond positively when we've been asked to attend events and publicize the work of the board. I think also it's important to say that in the materials that have already been issued, there's really some outstanding quality material for somebody like who's actually watched the YouTube videos that have been posted already. You walk away from some of them saying, those are good points. I'm going to share them in my own outreach events. So really grateful for the amount of effort that's going into this. Of course, we say this while down here in South Africa, we're in the peak of the third wave, and all the rest of the world, at least in some areas, have been moving on, really struggling in many ways with what COVID continues to do with our society. In respect of the topic that we're talking about now, though, and the LCE project, I like to echo the comments of others. There's just so much of work that has been done here that it's overwhelmed my mind. It's overwhelmed my printer as well, as we try to print out the detailed appendices. So congratulations for the efforts. It's passed every test in that way. But as Len said in his introduction, so much of what you're describing is not typical. Therefore, the review and preparation for this is hard to do. It's hard to think it through and to see the picture holistically. I have spent a lot of time with my own staff and with an ad hoc SMP group assembling comments. And I've only managed to send through comments this morning and not yet meet with you. That said, I'm of course committed to supporting and working with you throughout the next 10 days as we move to the conclusion on this item. I like to say this, that I have very little that I will be proposing to be added on. And I have very little to comment on the detail. So that's on parts 1 onwards. But my comments focus more clearly and plainly on the preface and authority of the standard. I could just say that everything Ido said is what I think as well. And I've heard others echo portions of Ido's comments. So I'm mostly aligned with what Ido described. Using the words that he described, particularly in respect of authority around the subjectivity of extensive areas of authority and how within the hands of different people we could arrive at different conclusions. I approach my comments, though, as I will during the course of today's conversation, really from the perspective of the regulator and the confusion that I'm already seeing in the comments I've received from SMP practitioners. I'm not sure after reading their comments whether they understand what we're trying to do or whether they support or oppose what we're trying to do. And I hope that as I raise issues today and tomorrow, marking those that I think are fatal or significant, that through a process of clarification, I will be able to reach a point of understanding myself before I commit to supporting the ED. So looking forward to it, I think that there is some divergence on some fundamental issues as we've heard throughout these early comments today. For example, on the area of what happens with the transitional guidance, the area of judgment around the authority, but I'll hopefully have some helpful ideas and point to what my issues are there. Thank you very much and all the best for the conversation that's coming up.
Okay, anyone else like to speak? So there's no doubt we're going to get to the substance in each section and people will have the chance to comment. I think the assumption is that there will be lots of comments and lots of discussion on substantive issues throughout, hence the amount of time we've given on the agenda for this topic. So we weren't expecting, I don't think the task force was expecting to say we're ready to vote today. We expected it would be a journey potentially leading up to Wednesday of next week. I am encouraged, though, particularly compared to where we were a year ago at this time, on how far we've come and that the potential for going out for comment does exist and it should be quite high. I think directionally lots of progress has been made, and so I look forward to the detailed discussions that we're going to have this week with the mindset that we're trying to get to an answer the best we can and as far as we can at this point in time, so that we could get public input on the topic and really begin to advance in an agile fashion. The one thing that I do think is useful and may help people's thinking is our thought process on the EM and how we'll go about it, because it may help people to get their heads around some of these unanswered topics. Just on the 600 point, I think it's quite clear the board has a current position. It's not, and I know Ada raised that point, but it doesn't, I think others have pointed out, it doesn't hurt to ask the question as well to the constituents. And we already heard that there are some stakeholders feel strongly in the other direction on it. So we would get it anyway. I'd rather direct people to a good substantive input on this topic. Kai, back to you. Would you or the team give us some idea of where we're heading with an EM if we get to an ED?
Thank you, Tom, and thank you all for the comments that you raised so far. I think Imran, you said that the papers overwhelmed your printer. I think both Bev and myself, I think, have broken multiple computers while doing this work, so it has been heavy work leading up to where we're at right now. So hopefully we'll get there now. I think as Sue asked for when you will see what's the approach for the EM, the intention is that we will bring back Wednesday this week, we will bring back an outline of items to be included and also the types of questions that we will have. So we will do that this week, and then in addition, following the week, as I'll present later, you will receive, the board will receive a draft of the EM with the questions to provide comments on as well later on. But I'll come back to that timeline later on. But it is following the discussions that we will have. We have a plan for when an outline for when things will be made available, and so that you will have some time to look into the EM. We understand it is crucial to both explain what is in this standard and the approach that we've taken, and also then describe or get into some detailed questions to provide the input we need in order to take this from a potential ED to the next level as well. So we will come back to you, as I said, Wednesday this week with an outline and types of questions, and then also give you a draft of the EM itself with questions later on. Yeah, I think that was to address your concern. I think, Ido, you said the AM has been taken out, so we're shorter, and whether or not we're including enough guidance for the auditors to do the work or not. I think, as we have described earlier, we have included some of the fundamental concepts in the EM, but what we also intend is to have like a first time through guide, and that we will also work with others to have more of a guide, somewhat similar maybe to the IFAX SMP guide or something, to help practitioners on how to use the standard when it eventually comes out as well. So there will be more done in this area. Not essentially, not everything will need to be done by this board, but we will work with others as well. Some people alluded to the length, and we're cautious on the length in both directions. I think the standard needs to be as long as it needs to be in order to get us in the right position. It's just that we need to keep that in the back of our head as well, not to add to the sake of adding. And I don't think that we would necessarily do, but it's a good point to have in our back. On your point, Erica, going in and out of the standard, I think this alludes to a little bit the discussion we had earlier, whether it's a separate standard or not. And I think we may get back to this a bit when we go into the authority piece, and it will be something that potentially is more covered off in the explanatory memorandum and the transitional piece that we will put in there as well. So I think that, Tom, I tried to summarize and address some of the questions that we heard on the general comments. So if there are no other reactions to that, maybe we should dive into the core discussion of this week, and starting discussing the different parts of the standard.
Let's do that. If just one last pause, any reaction now, or are we ready to get into the body of the standard? I think we're ready to get into the body of the standard.
Yeah, we're not all ready to go into the different parts yet. We will, if you go to the next slide, we'll start with the preface. We will come back to the preface to the IAASB standards later on, but this is the preface to the separate standard. Definition is mentioned here. As you've seen now, we've moved the definitions to an appendix, and as Ido said, there might be a few areas where we have used some terms that are not defined in the IAASB handbook. So there may need to be some additions to cover off some of those areas. And also the other is that we've used entities internal control system instead of the entity system of internal control. So we just need to make sure that we're covering off so that it is the same thing and that it's clear that it is the same thing. Symbols, as you saw the last time and discussed the last time, there were mixed views on whether to include the symbols in the standard. I think on balance, we received direction to take them out. I think also some of the reasoning behind that is following that this is a standard, and by including some of these symbols, it could allude to more of a methodology or a guide as such. So we've decided to take them out for now. Maintenance of the standard, that is one of the other big areas that we heard leading into this meeting, different views on the maintenance and the stable platform that we've set in the standard to be 3 years. I think we do continue to hear support for and ask for a stable platform, especially from the SMP community and a lot of others as well. But I think we are having issues with having indicating a 3-year period in the standard itself. So we have, this is something we need to take back to the task force, but in our initial discussions, we're thinking that we will take out the 3 years in the standard by just striking out the last words in that paragraph, so that it will say that it will be updated periodically, not to define the term. In terms of which process to go through, I think what our initial thinking is that when each ISA project is going through, they will do an evaluation whether or not they think this issue or update to a standard needs to be addressed for the LCEs, and then later, following that, there will be a specific project considering how the updates will be done to the LCE standard. I think it is something that we feel is essential, is done not as part of the ISA project. You need to evaluate whether it's an LCE issue or not, and it needs to be updated, but the update itself should be done outside the ordinary task force group of the standard itself. I think by including it the same, we may get the risk that when we update the standard, we as a board say, but let's just handle the scalability pieces in the LCE standard, and that we will not have the scalability in the ISAs, or the other way around, that we will just take the pieces we developed in the ISAs and complicate the LCE standard more than necessarily. So that's, as I said, something that we will have more discussion on the task force, but that's our initial thinking, and we also will ask questions on this on the EM. We also did get a suggestion to take out some of the detail of the table of content to shorten the standard. I think our thinking is that for this to go out on the ED, it would be better to include the details. It is something that we could reconsider later to shorten and not include the details in the table of content as well. Other than that, we have received some comments around that we're introducing concepts like inherent limitations in an audit prior to explaining what an audit is. So we will look at rearranging some of that. And also we've gotten some input on moving certain pieces that are in the preface into part 1. And also a view that the preface should focus solely on the entity and not so much on the audit. So those are some of the issues that we need to come back to. I think one of the other areas I can just highlight now is that if there is a specific question on a part in the standard in the EM, I think our intention is that we will highlight that in a way in the standard itself. So around maintenance, when you read the standard, and there will be an indication there that there is a specific question and a part explaining this in the EM as well, so that you can get the full picture by reading the standard itself. I think that was most of the comments we received so far. I think also leading into this meeting, we had some discussions with board members to discuss some of their views. So I'm very grateful for having the opportunity to do that. And I think by that, Tom, we could go to the next slide and hand back to you for comments on the preface.
Before we go to that, Kai, I guess one of the things that is coming up a few times is length, more or less. And I think you got it right, is like as much as is necessary. I think the length, quite focusing on length, there's two things as well. Is one, are we applying the right filter of what's more or less? Obviously, we should require as much as necessary, but not so much. But secondly, some of this is ameliorated by being in a digital format. So having a table of contents that's detailed may be quite useful because it might provide you hyperlinks to allow people to jump to the right sections. The same as I read the document, the blue boxes, where I certainly had some comments on how to slim them up. I think in a digital format, they would look differently too. So it may be useful as well to have that conception time, because I think that comment will come up quite a bit about length, more or less, throughout. But just something on the top of my head. I don't know if that's the task force has talked about that before we go to the preface. Is that fairly consistent with your thinking?
Yes, I think, as you said, the length and navigation is something that will help when we get into more digital format and the availability to get to the content needed. So very much in line with the discussion so far.
Okay, great. So let's talk about the preface. A number of you have noted comments on the preface in your introductory remarks. I know the task force is eager to hear them. So let's begin. Any first volunteer? Isabel.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to acknowledge and welcome the proposal that has been made to remove in paragraph 16 on the maintenance the end of the sentence, but not more frequently than once every 3 years. When I spoke with practitioners in France, they were enthusiastic at the idea of having a stable platform. But on the other hand, I was feeling uncomfortable with the idea that we could have a significant change in the ISA and not have it in the LCE standard. So I think the proposal you made perfectly reflect what we need. We need, anytime we change something in the ISA, to think about the LCE standard and see if there's an urgent need to modify, or if we can leave it like this, or if the change concerns only complex entity and does not need to be embedded in LCE. Having a fixed term of 3 years was really arbitrary, and it was even difficult to say that it was reflecting public interest. So very supportive of the removal of this end of the first sentence in paragraph 16. Thank you.
Thanks, Isabel. Josephine?
Thank you. I'll leave my comments on the applicability of the standard to the next section and just focus on this particular piece, if I may. Thank you, Kai, for the update on some of the feedback you received. I also am supportive of the task force considerations in relation to maintenance. I was actually quite concerned about the suggestion that this should only be more than every 3 years, and Isabel has articulated very clearly why. I'm not sure actually this should sit in the standard at all, though. I think this should sit really in the authority for the IAASB standards more generally, how we maintain all our standards, and sit together there. But perhaps something you could mull over. In terms of the preface itself, there are a couple of editorials which I've sent through, particularly in relation to P2, but in P1 we talk about a high quality audit. We don't really talk about that in our standards. So I've suggested instead we use wording that we developed very recently for our quality management standards, which talk about the performance of a quality audit engagement, and suggested editorials there. In terms of, it could be a good point to raise now, in terms of the blue boxes, as Tom says, we've noticed going through that some of these are about the why, you know, the story about why that particular set of requirements are required, and some of it is about the how. And I think what might be useful is for us to distinguish between those two. And it could be a matter of a title, it could be a matter of perhaps in the same way we do with 315. And then maybe stand back from that and say, you know, is that balance right? But sometimes it's quite difficult to work out, particularly where we'll come across a couple of places where, because it talks of the why and mixes the why and how, it almost implies that certain requirements could be overridden by the blue box. It's only a couple of places, but perhaps we could make that distinguish those. That would be helpful. Again, I just mainly have editorial comments on this piece. In terms of the inherent limitations, thank you for that. Yes, I do welcome that in the preface we actually talk about the purpose of the audit, which of course is to enhance the degree of confidence in the financial statements. Before we start talking about the limitations of the audit, I felt that didn't quite set the right tone. That's the first thing I saw when I came here, and I don't think that's really the message that we want to send. The message is about enhancing confidence primarily. In terms of P12 in the essential explanatory material, we say there's a simple line in there that says on the fourth bullet point that says, and does not impose additional obligations on the auditor. I think that the essential explanatory material does impose additional obligations, as it said in P14. That entire text is relevant to an understanding of the objective and proper application of its requirements. I understand that it's saying it doesn't mean there are extra requirements in here, but we have to see it, I imagine, the same way we think about our application material. So it's really a simple deletion of that and does not impose additional obligations, because P14 is very clear on what the material in the standard does and does not do. And as I say, in terms of the authority, I'll leave that to the next section, but those are my key points on the preface. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Imran?
Thank you very much. I got 3 or 4 comments on the preface, but coming after Josephine, I want to just repeat my support for the point she's just made about the connection between paragraph P12 and P15. Kai, I'm not sure where exactly the discussion of the title comes up, but I'm going to sneak my first comment in here about the title. I found that there is a fair bit of confusion that I heard back from SMPs based on how they read the meaning of this title. I think that the title comes across as if the ISA for an LCE is a subset of the ISAs. And as a consequence, people make all sorts of suggestions about why not introduce this as an ISA 900 series, or why duplicate this because it's in the ISAs. Why do you have this here? Why are you referring in the representation letter to ISAs for LCEs? Why not just refer to ISAs? And I think part of it references back to what we call the standard. And the evidence of it is in our own paperwork. If we see how our document 2D references, and 2D, of course, is the conforming amendments, the way it describes in paragraph 5 and 6, the ISAs versus the ISAs for LCE, it uses different terminology to describe what is it to be used for. So for example, it says in paragraph 5 that the ISAs are to be used in the order of historic financial information, but I don't know why it says in paragraph 6 that the ISAs is to be applied in the audit of financial statements. There is this similar inconsistency between paragraph 12 and 13 in 2D, which comes all the way back to the question of the title of the standard. So that's the first of my comments. The second one is about the compliance framework, which we've now built out and provided in some detail in paragraph P10. I heard back, and I'm not sure whether we've heard this before, that the level of complexity in a compliance reporting framework would render the engagement complex by definition, and therefore make the LCE standard inappropriate for that. I imagine that there may be some compliance frameworks that are very simple, but there may be many other compliance frameworks that require a level of judgment, interpretation, and application that would put it well within the description of things that are in A10. And therefore, what would we say in response when individuals say to us, but it can't and should not be used under those circumstances? My own experience in the area of compliance frameworks lacks, but certainly this is what the practitioners in that area said to me. On P11, which describes the various parts of the standard, I think that is a crucial addition that needs to be made here, and that is to list the appendices as being part of it, so that they are not seen to be outside the standard. So we list everything up to part 9, but not the set of appendices, which of course will bring in the definitions, which we point out elsewhere are indeed part of the standard. My last point here relates to the stable platform and maintenance, and I am grateful for what we've just heard around what will be deleted. But I favor a position, which I think I heard Josephine half describe, about whether we have the need at all for this section within the standard. So my position is that actually I disagree with the need for this section at all in the standard and the content of P16. And my reason for this would be, why make this commitment at all in our standard? How and when we change the standard is really an IAASB internal process and is not relevant to the preface to the standard. Furthermore, this 18-month rule really sets expectations that we can't ever be sure of without any experience on the topic, and possibly not even relevant to the standard, but rather this is a due process issue, something that could be dealt with in the explanatory memo. And I've had other suggestions about where this could move. So really a strong case about not committing to what we have here, but rather removing it from P16. So I'm going to keep score of the things that I've asked to be removed, so that when I ask for things to be inserted, I'm not accused of lengthening the standard. Thank you.
Thank you, Imran. Yosh?
Thank you, Chair Tom, and thank you very much for the Kai Morton and task force members. I have 2 comments. The first one is echo of the Josephine comment, just editorial comment. At page 4, paragraph P.1, the statement which is result in high quality audit is not consistent with the other ISAs. In the ISAs, there is not such statement, but only a statement that reasonable assurance is provided. The second one is definition. Regarding definition at the P.13, we support the direction to use the same definitions as in the other ISAs. The task force intends to include the definitions as an appendix in the ISA for LCE, but issues paper agenda item 2, paragraph 32, and states that definition will not be included in the standards for consultations. From the perspectives of making the ISA for LCE functional on its own, it would be better to present the standard as a whole, including the appendix, from the stage of consultations, and ask for comments on the overall LCE standards. Thank you, that's all.
Thank you. Next is, hold one second. Wendy.
Okay, thanks, Tom. So the part I had the most comments on was the stable platform. So I'm glad we've already discussed that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the name. I'm okay with the name. I can imagine, as I've been part of discussions like this before, how much discussion has taken place on the name. But what is still not clear to me, when you look in P1, it says it's based on the ISAs, and I said it in my opening remarks. Does a practitioner using this standard have to have knowledge of what is in those ISAs to execute on this standard, or is it completely standalone? So that's not quite clear to me. I'm not quite sure where that might go, but it's referenced right in P1. So I wanted to put that out there. And then I thought I'm not quite sure where the place is, but I had a comment in this section on what's been fully excluded from the entire standard. So I'm I'm okay with 610, 600 we already talked about in 701. But I'm curious why 800 isn't mentioned anywhere. And that's all I have on the preface.
Okay, we'll have to cut. We'll actually have to pause on the name in a little bit. So that will be definitely a topic we come back to at the end of the roundtable tour, Tom. Next is Caillou.
Thanks, Tom. I have two comments. The first is referring to P7 last bullet. The statement in this bullet point is not, in my view, equivalent to the premise of an audit as defined in ISA 210 and repeated in ISA 200 paragraph A2. In particular, missing is item little double I of A2 little c. There's a fundamental difference between providing access to information and actually providing information that the auditor has requested. Consequently, in A2 little c, little triple I needs to be incorporated here. It is also not in line with paragraph 431. Then I have a second comment. The second comment refers to P16. I believe that the IAASB should consider parallel amendments whenever significant changes are made to the ISAs. However, changes to the LCE should be kept to a minimum really needed. I also not see the danger over the long run of the LCE standard growing incrementally longer over time. That's all, thanks.
Thank you. Diane.
Yep, I have two comments. Both are repeats from other folks. So consistent with the OSHA's comment on P1, I think that very last phrase of results in a high quality audit should reference reasonable assurance. I also think that would provide a nice contrast to the section that we've got regarding inherent limitations, where we talk about why you can't achieve absolute assurance. So I think that would connect nice. And then I agree with Imran on the maintenance. I like the direction you're going. I just don't think it even needs to be placed in the standard. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Eric.
Thanks, Tom. I have a couple of comments. First of all, I just wanted to say I supported the suggestion that Kai made about the way the maintenance paragraph might be revised. I think it is useful to keep it in the preface, you know, even though it may not be you know, totally germane to the preface, but I think it is helpful to users of the standard to understand how the standard is being updated. My other comment ties in a little bit to what Wendy said a couple of minutes ago. The scope of the standard, which in P1 says it's designed to apply to audits of financial statements. In my outreach, a number of people told me that, you know, in audits of LCEs, they not only do audits of the financial statements, but they may also be required to do some audits of single elements or accounts or balance sheets. So, you know, and this comes to the larger preface item as well, is I just wonder whether we or the task force should consider making the scope of this standard consistent with the scope of the ISAs in terms of allow it to be adapted as necessary to you know, to audits of other historical financial information. And those are my two comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Sue?
Thank you. Like others, I've sent editorials, so I'm going to concentrate on the major points. And in this area, it was just on the maintenance. And Kai, I think the suggestions that you were making are very helpful in responding to some of those concerns, and I particularly support the fact that maintenance is considered within an individual project, so outside of the LCE team, so that if there is consideration of a kind of limited change or an urgent update, that's done at the time the project is being undertaken. So I think that's really helpful. And I probably support keeping that in the preface. I think Imran said this is kind of an IAASB, almost like a housekeeping issue, but I think it is relevant for people like methodology and software providers, and a lot of SMPs use things that are externally purchased. So I think that setting that expectation to allow those kind of organisations to plan their work plan and understand what the intention is helpful. Thanks.
Thank you. Edo.
Yes, thank you, Tom. I think we've discussed maintenance. That's where I had a question. But that has been the direction that the task force will be taken on this, and the suggestion, as Sue pointed out as well, that's exactly where I am. I'm not too concerned whether it's in or out that section. I had a comment with respect to the other preface. Agenda item 2D, are we suggested to provide that comment now or later?
Later.
Okay, that's it then. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Lynn?
Thank you very much. I just wanted to come in and support the point that Josephine made about the blue boxes. One, to divide up between the whys and the hows, because I think it's confusing. And secondly, adding to her point, the blue boxes actually precede the definition of what a blue box is, and I think that needs to be changed. On the matter of maintenance, I think the key issue that users out there want to understand and have is a stable platform. So I am in the camp of leaving it within the standard and amending it as suggested. Thank you.
Okay, anyone else? So there are a couple big issue items. The title we'll get to in a second. On the maintenance one, I think there seems to be movement towards support of where the current articulation, as Kai put it at the start of the session. Is that correct if I'm reading the room right? I have one general just remark is I'm fine with discretion of this board to consider amendments, but I think we should be very disciplined throughout on how much we upset a stable platform, and that I think our stand should be more often than not. Personally, I'm fine with the current position to preserve a stable platform for a few years because of the disruption. Okay, the world, we have a set of standards that we've revised and given implementation periods for. Obviously, we'd like to get the standards implemented sooner rather than later, but the world isn't going to break apart if those amendments haven't been made, and they're still issuing reasonable assurance opinions on the old ISA 315 in the process. So I just worry about the cost benefit of too many amendments to keep up with the full ISAs, and that the general stance should be towards stability with a reasonable review period as possible. So I'm fine with the current position. I just want to note that caution to the board as we go forward, if this is going to be really useful and not adding undue cost onto LCEs for a small benefit in return. I think we need to determine, is the majority of the board supportive of Kai's articulation in terms of how we'll consider maintenance? That's one. And two, should we keep it in the preface? So if it's a general support of Kai's direction on maintenance and keeping it within the preface, could I see a show of hands? Or Kai, if people feel like they need Kai to restate where it's going.
Ask Kai to restate that.
Kai, could you restate it again for people's benefit?
Yeah, I think my suggestion was, or the task force consideration so far, is to leave it in the standard, but then in P16, that the first sentence will read, the IAASB expect to propose amendments to the ISO standard periodically, full stop, and then delete, but not more frequently than once every 3 years. So that will be then what will be in the preface.
And Imran, to some extent, that goes to your issue too, without being too specific about our work in detail about what periodically means. There's an overwhelming view of the board on this point. I count 10, 13, 14, me 15, 16. So yes, the overwhelming majority, the unanimity on this point. Right, lower hands. The title's a big one. There were a number of comments on the appropriateness of the title. Lynn, is your hand up on this topic, on the title? Or okay. So we really do need to come to grips with the title. My personal view is I'm comfortable with the title as being sufficiently different if we use it. I do think we probably have to provide some extra description that it's not a subset and etc. But I thought we have in the past, but we could reiterate it. It's very similar to IFRS for SMEs too. People have managed to understand that's a separate set of standards. Just being part of that original debate, I guess 15 years ago, very similar concerns were raised at the time, and we were able to manage it. My concern personally from a brand perspective is we use something less than ISAs. We could, that's what people understand out there. I think gravitate, we could give the false impression that this standard produces less quality than not. I honestly think we've been arguing that it produces high quality results, reasonable assurance opinion, and I think it's sufficiently different. But I also think it could be addressed through the EM. That's my personal viewpoint. I certainly would welcome others on this title because I know there's other points of view on the title, but I think it's something that I would be comfortable going out as is with appropriate explanation of how it relates and getting comment on this topic as well. A hand on this topic, Josephine.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, I already expressed reasons at great length as to why I had concerns about the title of this standard. That said, I did say to the task force when I wrote to them last week that I was a lot more comfortable with the direction this was taking, which was an attempt to actually specifically identify this standard as being separate from the suite of ISAs. I know there was a conversation about it being a series. I certainly couldn't support that. So I have some very tiny, but I think they're quite important to me, suggestions that we don't summarize this as a ISA for LCE. I think it should be ISA LCE. And I've made some editorial suggestions in the preface and sent that to the task force, including a little bit more on whether or not the aspects then we talk about that the ISAs or our standards as a whole include objectives, requirements, application, other explanatory material, etc., which this standard does not. So I think there is a need to perhaps articulate that a little bit better in the preface before it goes out on exposure. But I am in a better place than I was, you know, provided that perhaps some of these editorials I've suggested could be taken on board as well, just to make it absolutely clear this is not an ISA. Okay, thank you.
Any other thoughts? So Josephine, what are you suggesting that everything in the standard where it says ISA for LCE should be ISAs hyphen LCE? I'm not sure exactly what you're suggesting, and I think you're asking for consideration. It would be
no, it's just simply dropping the full from those from the acronyms. So just ISA LCE is what, as if it were one word, because it's an international standard of auditing for this particular type of entity. It's not international standards of auditing, and so it is a very different thing from that perspective.
okay. Who's comfortable with the current title as it is? Let's talk about ISIS for LCE, or who prefers Josephine's approach? Maybe who feels as strongly as Josephine about this issue by show of hands?
I very much doubt others feel as strongly as I do about this particular point.
Well, I just, Imran?
Sure, I didn't, I raised it in the context of the way we needed another title. I didn't particularly identify harmoniously with what Josephine described. But of course, I was concerned that we were describing this in a different way to the ISAs in the document by reference 2D, and it would be really useful to understand why we describe these standards in different ways and what they can be used for. Is there something about the name of the standard that makes us have to use different words in describing what it can be used for? Because it's very distinctly different in paragraph 5 and paragraph 6 of 2D, the way it's described in paragraph 12 and 13, in the way it's described of 2D.
I think that's a slightly different issue. Maybe we pick up on that. Len? I'm not ignoring it.
Yeah, Tom, I was going to raise the same comments that everyone just did, because I actually struggling with paragraph 5 and 6 in 2D. So I was just asking for more clarification from Kai, why we have that distinction between historical financial information versus financial statements. But Tommy just said that's a different issue, so I can wait.
Okay, I think it is a slightly different issue. We'll pick it up after this. I think we need to get clarity on the title of the standard, and then we'll clarify the issue that both you and Imran raised afterwards. Adam?
Yeah, I think we fed back as well that that we're not. It's not critical for me, the name ISA for LCE, but I would also prefer a different name. But that's more in the preference area, and I think Josephine feels a little bit stronger than I. But just wanted to articulate where I stand on the spectrum.
My understanding on this question, Kai and Bev, is that this is the title and the sufficient clarity associated with the title is an EM question. Is that so, Josephine? If we could deal with this in the EM a little bit, and maybe even cite an alternative viewpoint, would that be sufficient to address your point?
Yes, I'm sorry. This has probably taken more time than I had actually anticipated I needed for it.
I only raised it because a couple of people raised the title. And, I'd rather get clarity on it. And the brand is important. We've spent so much time on authority. It's connected to what you call it actually is related to the authority point in my mind too. So I didn't mind taking a second to talk about it. But you're okay with the outcome here?
Yeah, I thought that the task force had really responded to my comments on this previously by making it very distinct in the actual authority of our standards overall. I just had some minor tweaks to that acronym, that's all. So
Okay.
yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now, Kai, could you or a team respond to Imran and Len's question that they raised?
Sure. I think it also somewhat related to what Eric and I think it was Wendy also alluded in their comments. We should have more on the 800 series as such. I think in the development we had not contemplated looking into the other areas. I think based on the comments we have received, we need to look a bit further on that. So I think that's the reason why the name is specific on audit of financial statements and on specific parts as it could be following the 800 series, and also then in the preface of this the 2D document. So that's the reason for being specific there. But based on the comments that we have received now, we maybe should look into the 800 series to see if that should be included more in this document or not.
Okay. Okay, thank you. And there was one other issue that was raised that and you probably will have picked up on others, but the issue of compliance audits and whether we've addressed it appropriately. I think Imran raised the point originally, but I think we just need to give you clarity as we go into this final stretch before an ED proposal.
Yeah, we will look a bit further into that as well to see how that is addressed. I think there could be different, that complexity. I think you also raised the compliance framework may or may not be complex as such. So we can look to see, but Bev, anything specific that you want to come in on here?
Yeah. So just on the compliance audits, we didn't have them in the March draft, and we got a strong steer from the board to include them. So we have included them. So I think the question is, are they in or out? So just some guidance as to whether we have it in or out will be helpful. Thank you.
Okay, any comment on compliance audits? Eric?
Yes, I support them being in. As I said earlier, I think there's scope for using the standard beyond just the financial statement. So I think it should cover all frameworks and not just generally accepted frameworks.
Thank you. Sachika?
Thank you. I have a similar view with Eric's. At least in my jurisdiction, compliance framework is mainly used for, smaller types of audits. So I think it should be included. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Jim?
Thanks, Tom. I think you find compliance audits quite often in governmental. And I think it would be fine to include them in this as well.
Thank you. Josephine?
Yeah, I was one who raised this point at the last meeting. So yes, I'm very supportive of the task force including them. Thank you.
Okay, Kaiue?
I support compliance audits being things SEs often use compliance frameworks. Thanks.
Okay, Imran, I just go back to you. You raised it. Are you happy with the current situation and where people are landing? I believe it was you who raised it, if my notes were correct.
Yes, it was me, and I raised it based on practitioner input that I got on it. I don't think the conversation that we've just had captures the point that I raised. The point I raised was that a compliance framework is complex. Will the LCE standard be robust enough for it to be applied within that context? So I understand why some people believe that the need is there. Does it not contradict the factors and characteristics we have in A10. That's the issue.
So, okay, I understand the point now. Wouldn't you have to go through the same assessment for compliance audits as you would for other audits? And you would have that same filter, and that it's just not by the sheer nature of the compliance audit are you into the LCE. That was my reading. Billy has his hand up.
I can understand that. That makes sense.
Yeah. If that's the case, would you be supportive? And if
yes, I'm supportive.
Billy, why don't you come in and maybe give him some further context that may help his thing.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. I think during the conversation we've, and I fully get that we've probably just used shorthand. So in talking shorthand, we've said compliance audits, but I think we should just be clear, it's still an audit of financial statements. And what we're saying is those financial statements can be prepared either using a fair presentation framework or a compliance framework. And irrespective of whether that's a fair presentation framework or compliance framework, the preconditions for an audit must still be met, which means the framework must be acceptable. So I think that covers off that the framework in itself has to be acceptable for audit to be conducted. And then one would hope that whichever entity applies either a fair presentation framework or compliance framework would go through the characteristics that we have in the authority. And based on that, you will either be in or out of the ISA for LCE.
Why you have a technical director to correct and expand on the shorthand of the chair when he's giving a flawed explanation. Imran, any reaction?
No, nothing further. Tom, very happy with the way.
Okay, I think we've dealt with compliance, that framework out. Kai, back to you.
Thank you. I think we have then discussed mostly all of the major themes that came through in the comments. The only thing that I will highlight is on P1. Yes, we have received some of the wording, and we will look at, as you said, Josephine, aligning to what we have and see if we can do that. Other than that, as I said, we will look at the individual comments that have come through as well, so that we can actually address them in a good way.
Okay, are we done with this section now? Okay, I think you guys earned a break. We'll take a 12-minute break and begin at 10 minutes after the hour for another, I think we have 50 minutes to run today, and then we'll reconvene later in the day, our East Coast time. Okay, could we start rejoining? So, and the must-have, we must complete the authority section before we break this morning. In the nice-to-have, we could try to get through one more section. So, fingers crossed on the much-beloved authority section of this paper. And I turn it back to Kai.
Thanks, Tom. We have received some comments already on the authority, and I think some people alluded to comments on the authority in their opening remarks, so that we have some things that we need to go through there. I think what we tried to do in the revision to the authority section, make it more clear that the basis or that the limitations consists of two parts, as you see here. First, you have the specific restrictions, and then if you pass those specific restrictions, you could then move on to evaluating the qualitative characteristics. So we try to set it up better in a way that you see that there is a link. First, you need to go through and check that you are in compliance, or that you don't come across any of the specific restrictions. And then if you're good, then you need to go through and still evaluate whether you're a less complex entity or not. So, because as we said, this is this standard is for audits of financial statements of less complex entities. So you need to be a less complex entity, how we define it in this standard. So as you see, having the specific restrictions, we will come on the next slide. I will go more into some of the public interest characteristics, how that is done. The qualitative characteristics, what we try to do here is to be more descriptive and what is meant by them and how you can consider each item. We have received input that we're more focused on, let's say, scoping things out, and when you're not an LCE, so maybe we need to include a bit, see if we can include a bit more on when you're an LCE, on the more, let's say, more of the positive side here as well. So that is something that we will look into a bit. I think, as someone alluded to in the beginning as well, that some has the concern that there is too much judgment in the qualitative characteristics, and also some uncertainty on how to apply them. This is an area we need to discuss a bit further with the task force, and we maybe need to include some more specific examples in here as well. So as we said earlier, this is also an area where we will include a specific section in the explanatory memorandum and have specific questions related to the authority as well. I think to respond to some of the questions already, the authority section is set up for the evaluation to be done on the engagement, but it also serves multiple purposes to help the jurisdictions and firms as well set up their environment. We did receive a question also around how the basis for limitations links to the specific restriction in qualitative characteristics. The basis, what we have in A5, in a way sets the frame for how we developed the specific restrictions and qualitative characteristics. So A5 in a way is describing the whole limitation section, and the details of that comes in A7 and following. So with that, as I say, specific restrictions, if you're out on any of these criteria, for sure you're out of using the standard. If you're still in compliance with the specific restrictions, you need to go through and do the evaluation. As well, I think we have received a comment that some of what we have here in the restrictions coming further may be a bit onerous on the judgment to be done by the engagement partner as well on the engagement specifically. So we need to look at that. So if we go to the next slide. Public interest characteristics. this is authority has been something that we've been coming back to and discussing multiple times, maybe also public interest entities and the link and alignment with IAASB project. This slide shows a bit of the similarities and differences to what they have done and what we are doing. What we are trying to do is describe the entities and restrict who can use the standard. We have based that on the ED or the characteristics of those entities in the ED as aligned with the IAASB. Also, because we think that the entities in those 4 bullets that we had on the that are in A7C, the first four bullets there, because they are entities that have complexities. So we think that no matter if IAASB has that list or not, they are entities that has complexities and should be ruled out for using this standard. We need to follow closely what IAASB is doing. We know that they have not yet even summarized all their output or input from the consultation to their board. So we are following closely and aligning with that, and there may be further development as we go. As I said, there is based on similar wording to what they have done. And we will look at that when they come closer as well. I think this is an area where it's important for us to describe in the explanatory memorandum and have specific questions on it. And I think also the main point here is that we are using the input in a different way. I think IAASB is using their definition to describe public interest entity, to give them more public interest and have additional criteria. What we are doing is to make sure that entities of complexity, and we believe that those 4 that we have there is entities that has complexities and should be ruled out. So they are defining who they are. We're making sure that entities with complexity goes out. So we're in a different direction to what they're doing in a way. The supplemental guidance will also explain further the modifications to these categories. But as I said, we believe still that even though the IAASB project is in movement and will probably change based on the feedback that they have or may change, we think it's appropriate to use this as the basis for our ED and the authority section as well. So I think with that, we can move on to the next slide. That was the main intro that I wanted to do to the authority section. As you've seen, we've tried to address the comments that we received in May from the board. We have received some comments on that more of the firm judgments that are in the supplemental guidance probably should move into the authority section, so we can look at that. But I think with that, Tom, we can hand back to you to comments on the authority of the standard, and also I think the supplemental guide and the authority of the standard. If you have any significant or fatal comments to any of that, it will be great to include that at this point. Other than that, I think sending those comments through written comments as well is helpful to us. But if there is anything significant or fatal in there, please raise it as we go through the authority itself. So Tom, with that.
Thanks, Kai. Okay. I know people won't be bashful on this topic. Hey, Dale.
Yes, Tom, thank you. I won't be repeating what I said before, but maybe a little bit more granular comments. I think the authority has some useful language around when you're in doubt, you're out. And I think that is a concept that should be taken forward into the supplement as useful language, and I think that language needs to be carried over into the authority. such that when a firm or a practitioner is in doubt on whether it's applicable or not, then you're likely not. Just wanted to comment on pi. I am fine with the categories that are there. Appreciate the explanations that Kai provided around them. There is, however, the ability for local standard setters and regulators to widen that element by putting quantitative criteria around it, and those could be potentially quite significant. And I'm concerned about that. So my preference would be that pies are out altogether. And I just wanted to reaffirm my view that groups should not be part of this. And then my last comment is that, and Kai explained this previously, is that as they are carrying over the requirements from the full ISAs or considering the requirements of the full ISAs, certain situations have been considered either rare or indicative of complexity. And that is absolutely fine, but I would then prefer that those situations are also being dealt with in the authority as a restriction for use of this standard. And I'm thinking of areas around 560, and there were a few others that I fed back to the task force. If those situations then occur and we haven't carried over the requirements, that should be also a stop for using the standard. So those are the comments that I wanted to provide in addition to my opening comments. Thank you.
And I just want to dive a little bit deeper on one of your points, just to make sure I understand it. It seems to me your concern is jurisdictional differences on who's covered by the standard, and that by not having pi, that may be an issue altogether. Is that my understanding of where you're driving on this point, when jurisdictions could add to the categories that are prohibited?
No. It's more loosening. So, for example, an entity, and maybe I've understood it wrong, but if there's an entity whose main function is to take deposits from the public, and I've read the blue box underneath it, that a local legislative authority or relevant local body can provide a quantitative threshold such that potentially most of those would be allowed to use this standard. So let's say that a local body would say, well, we recognize that entities that take deposits from the public are out, but only those that have a asset total of more than 100 million. And I think that would then go beyond what we would think is appropriate for the use of this standard.
Okay, I now understand. I still think I'm sort of understand where you are. I thought that was prohibited because C was in but jurisdictions we're still leaving it open to. That's a good. I understand your point now. Thank you for clarifying it to me. Okay, we'll probably come back to that in a second. Anyone with a similar point of view as Ado who wants to speak first? Okay, Josephine, I want to make sure that we get this fully vetted right now. Josephine?
Thank you. Yes, of a similar mind to Ada on this. I'm coming at it from the perspective of where, say, a jurisdiction doesn't actually pay attention to what they can and cannot restrict. And therefore, the key thing here is when we were developing the standard, what did we have in mind when we were setting requirements and objectives, and to some extent excluding requirements, application material and other material from our standards in this standard, because we set that with this particular list of entities, so the A, B and C in mind, along with those entities that have qualitative characteristics. As a result of this, and I do recognise it's very difficult to restrict on matters that are more judgmental in nature. I understand that, but as we're not setting quantitative criteria, I think these qualitative characteristics do also need to be restricted, so that whenever somebody comes to this standard, they know that this is what the standard's intention was, or this was the intention of the board when they set objectives and requirements for this standard. And therefore, it just means changing some of the language and moving away from professional judgment and just reminding the user that these are proxies for matters or circumstances for which the standard was developed. So, as I say, in which case characteristic D wouldn't stop for me. We then move to E and have including there the qualitative characteristics set out in A9 to A10 exist in this environment. I'm not as worried about the point that was raised that we need more positive in here. I think some of that can be done with a supplementary material in terms of, whilst looks beyond what's in the qualitative characteristics and states what might be an LCE. I'm pretty much okay with that. I agree. If Kai, you're of the view that the IAASB task force and board or the board are coming at it from a different direction, I'm not sure that's entirely true. I think there is some implicit or intrinsic complexity in their decisions when it comes to PI entities there. So we might need to make sure that we're clear on that. But if that is the case, then I also agree with Ado, then we need to be a little bit stricter about what we're doing and how we're looking at C as well. But to some extent, I thought what we were using this PI group and then graying it out, as it were, for our standard when we go to exposure, because that's not really up for debate because IAASB are dealing with this. So do you think we really need to be clear about what we were using these for? And in which case, if we are seeing them as our own PI and moving away from where IAASB is going, then I agree with Ado. We shouldn't be allowing modification for those from that perspective. And that was those are my main points, Tom, on those authority. Thank you.
Thank you. Kai, you Bev, sort of respond to that, and I'll invite other comments, or would you like others to comment if they have specific views on this topic? It may be useful just to share your thinking on how this would be applied.
Yeah, I think I can start, and then Bev, if you have additional comments, you can do that as well. I think the thinking, as I explained in the introduction as well, that even if you are not specifically restricted, you would still need to comply with the qualitative characteristics. So I think more likely than not, even if jurisdictions amend the criteria in A7C, and that you allow, for example, an entity that take deposits from the public within below a certain size limit, you would still have the level of complexity that you will be ruled out by the qualitative characteristics. So I think even when we had the discussion at the National Standards Studies meeting, they said, why do we even include what's here in A7C? Because this is jurisdictional and should be dealt with at jurisdictional level. So I think, yes, you need to comply with the qualitative characteristics. And if jurisdictions amend what is in A7, I think on engagement, you will be out anyway. Bev, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I just want to come back to Josephine's point about sort of being consistent with IAASB. So where we are is we're consistent with the IAASB ED. We know that they have had lots of comments. What we don't know is where they're going to go with it. We've heard sort of what their task force has discussed. They haven't gone to the board yet. So we're just waiting to see. So it's a little bit awkward for us really to then put this up, because what we don't want is everybody commenting on ours, on the comments that they gave to IAASB. So we will have to have some language and explain around what our intent is. And obviously this is, I'll just call it a moving target at this point. I don't think we want to be inconsistent with the IAASB, but at the same time, we also don't want to sort of be judged in this area on what they have. Our intent here is to exclude entities with public interest characteristics. And the reason that we do allow these modifications, and it's in particular around maybe the last two categories that the IAASB has heard a lot on, and that's the collective investment vehicles and the post-employment benefits. And in most cases, those are, they do have public interest characteristics, but there are several countries, so Australia, Canada, where they have very, very small collective investment schemes. There really isn't a lot of public interest in there. They may have very small retirement benefit funds where there's one beneficiary to it. So would you say that that's public interest? And this standard in particular could still be used for those. So just because they're sort of falling into that category doesn't mean that you have to specifically exclude it. So I think that's what we were trying to sort of allow jurisdictions to do. So either you're out, so if the jurisdiction does nothing, then these types of entities could never use them. Or the jurisdiction, if they're sophisticated enough, could then say, well, we've got these really small ones. We do think that you can use the ISA for LCE for that because it meets all of the other criteria. Therefore, we can modify on that basis. So that was really the intention. And we can explain a little bit more in the EM around this. And also that we will obviously have a look at where the IAASB goes because we don't want to end up being inconsistent. It'll just make it really awkward for everyone. Thank you.
Any other comments on this specifics, these specific paragraphs? By show of raised hands, be fine. Edo, I wanted to go back to you. I don't know if this entirely assuages your concern on it, but I don't know if you wanted to react to what you just heard, though.
No, I don't think so, Tom. So the intention of the task force, of course, is the right one, where they say, well, if the local bodies don't do anything, then they're out, and that's the right approach. So I'm not sure I could come up with an approach that's different other than eliminating them altogether. But I also, and this is the local bodies taking their responsibility for not setting those quantitative thresholds too high. But that's probably then more on them than on us. But I, of course, understand that complexity would be the overriding principle. But I've said before that there's a couple of judgmental items in there that could be argued either way. Thank you.
Thank you. Good discussion there. Okay, Sachika.
Thank you. First of all, as a general comment to the authority, I am very supportive of the direction. As I commented on the previous meeting, I think we need to provide some flexibility so that each jurisdiction can determine right applicability based on each circumstances. So as Bev already explained, I think this is a very good approach, and we are moving toward a right balance. And regard to this section, I have 3 comments. One is relating to paragraph A5 and A10. I think the relationship between paragraphs A5 and A10 is not very clear. My understanding is that paragraph A10 expands and provides examples of qualitative characteristics relating to overarching principles described in 2nd and 3rd bullets of paragraph A5. But it is not very clear to me whether and how overarching principles in paragraph A5 link to each bullet in paragraph A10. So I think some clarification is very helpful so that the respondent to the exposure draft can determine the appropriateness of the authority of either for LCE, particularly with regard to paragraph A10. And my second comment is on footnote 3 on paragraph A7. Paragraph A7D states that either for LCE shall not be used if it is group audit. And the definition of the group financial statement is described in footnote 3, but footnote 3 does not explain what consolidation process means in either 600 revised. And I think it is very important because the meaning of consolidation process in revised ISO 600 is not the same as those in accounting standards. So, and on this one, I found footnote 1 of paragraph 12C in the agenda item 2C has already described about the definition of consolidated process. And I think footnote 3 of paragraph A7 of the standard can also include the same descriptions. And my last comment is black bullet 3 on paragraph A10. It said ownership or oversight structure are complex, such as where there are multiple owners, but the factor of multiple owners may, I think, too much narrow the scope of either for LCE, because it seems to suggest that ownership structure is complex if there is, two owners for a very small entity. So I would suggest perhaps the task force can, think about the, appropriateness of this description. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Sashka. Yosh?
Thank you, Tom. I have just 2 comments about the paragraph A7. About the scope of application of A7, there are statements that small a, law or regulation 1, prohibits the use of the draft ISA for LCE, and small c, an entity meets one of the following criteria. 5, an entity is specified as not able to use the draft ISA for LCE by law or regulations. But the difference between small a1 and small c5 is not clear for me. So can I ask you to explain more clearly? And second one, and as for the list of prohibited application of LCE ISA for PIs at paragraph A7C, the last sentence of the EEM blue box states category cannot be removed, but it is unclear who can or cannot remove it. If the audit firm can remove it, it would be appropriate to include it in paragraph A8. Thank you. That's it.
Okay, we get clarification on that. Bev, do you want to explain the difference between AI and CV?
I will do, thank you. And we've had a couple of comments on this, so we will need to clarify. And Car keeps bringing it up, and I think it's really obvious. But anyway, we'll need to make a change, and we have actually explained it in the supplemental guidance. But the A1 is the blanket. A jurisdiction just goes, we're not interested. You can't use the standard. You don't go further than that. So it's a very blanket sort of a prohibition on use of the standard. When we get to C, we're looking at specific categories of entities. So we've given what we think in C1 to 4 as the types of entities that we think exhibit complexity through their nature of having public interest characteristics. A jurisdiction may decide for whatever reason that there's another type of entity in their jurisdiction, category of entity. And one doesn't necessarily come to mind, but I'm just going to use this, and I don't mean this by any means, but for example, they may say mining entities. There's just a complexity around mining entities, and they don't want anyone using ISA for LCE to use it. So that would, so the C5 would relate to a specific category of entity that a jurisdiction decides should also be prohibited from use of the standard. So we will clarify that though, but that's the difference between the two. Thank you.
Okay. Yosh, I hope that was a clear explanation. Okay, Eric?
Thanks, Tom. I just wanted to indicate strong support for the approach in dealing with the public interest entity issue and allowing flexibility for jurisdictions to make amendments where it's appropriate in their circumstances. I have only got 2 comments on this area. The first is really around the description of the characteristics and the linkage between, let me just get the right paragraph here. the paragraph A9 and in the supplement paragraph 21, and they're both really talking about the same thing, which is that not one particular characteristic may not knock you out of the standard, but it's more of a judgment call relative to the nature and extent of those characteristics. And the wording is used differently as between A9 and paragraph 21 in the supplement. And I just wonder if people might become a bit confused about the intent there. So I'm just suggesting that you take a look and see whether those two paragraphs can be made more aligned in that respect. And the other comment that I wanted to make is I think it's been very helpful that the standard helps by indicating the nature of requirements that have not been included in the standard. And I think Josephine and maybe some others have already alluded to that. We have a similar view in that it would be helpful to have a broader understanding of the nature of the requirements that have been excluded. It is an improvement over the previous draft, but it still leaves readers a little bit hanging about what's in and what's out of the standard. And I think that's going to be very important as people read the standard and try and understand the nature of the entities that it's going to apply to. So I'd suggest, we realize that the mapping document has a complete analysis of everything that's in and out, but it may be helpful to have a bit more depth in the explanatory memorandum and in the authority as well, or the supplementary guidance as well, just to give a bit of a picture, an overall summary. Thank you. Those are my comments.
Thanks, Eric. Next is Wendy.
Had some trouble with the unmute. Sorry. Thank you, Tom. Just a couple things. Some is repeat. I agree with the approach on PIE. Overall, I want to say I like both the authority and the supplemental guidance. I would like a definition of LCE. However, it rings to me like quality. We know what it isn't. So I'm okay if that doesn't get in. I particularly liked the supplemental, the picture, the decision tree on page 1 of 2C, the supplemental guidance. And at the same time, though, I did get feedback that illustrated too much flexibility, but I also mentioned earlier, I'm willing to live with that in the context of, I think, even in the jurisdictional differences and the full ISAs, we have to navigate that in group audits. So, okay, getting to group audits, I'm okay with the approach that we've talked about in terms of how it's going to be in the exploratory memorandum. I would like something on components, and I know there's been a number of places where the task force has said we're not addressing it, but I just want to put out there that I think we should rethink that in the authority section. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you. Imran, by the way, nice shirt, Imran.
Hey, Tom, I was going to say that I want to thank Amy for sending you and I the memo together with a few other board members that Monday was a red letter day, right? So I've managed to send in some detailed comments on the authority section. This is the area where my primary concerns lie, and several fall into the significant stroke fatal area, but I won't take advantage of the plenary to raise them here. The first is this, this question, which seemingly is a little bit vague or confusing in the standard, about who makes the determination of whether this standard is appropriate or not for a client and then for the engagement. One can't make that determination yet simply by reading the authority section as to who makes that determination. But one can infer that from 4.21 and 482 within the standard. So if indeed that is how it is meant to happen, the way 4.21 and 482 describe it, I would see a need, please, for us to repeat 4.21 and 482 in the authority or something similar to it. So it has a logical starting point. Otherwise, the question that's posed is, so who is this authority section for? Who should be reading it and understanding it and applying it? However, I guess my challenge with that understanding, the way it's structured, is that is the basis of selection of the approach the job of the auditor under the ISAs, and therefore under the ISAs for LCE, is that the responsibility then of the auditor still to be able to do this? The concern, and I've heard this already in writing from practitioners. The concern is that, and I'll use Ido's words here because it's been used 3 times now, is that this approach will lead to clients shopping around to find that auditor who is prepared to use the standard. And let me put it to you this way. This is another way of describing this problem. A really significant public interest issue is that what I've already heard practitioners say to me is that commercial considerations will be driving the authority debate. And how are we going to avoid addressing this in the way it's currently based? I guess another way of talking about the same point is that SMPs who are mindful of competitive pressures, but it could equally apply to big firms, may say that when someone doesn't have knowledge or experience, then they may incorrectly make the determination that what they are dealing with is an LCE, whereas in fact it's something far more complicated, but because they lack understanding about this topic, they come to the conclusion that it's an LCE. The second one is, can the entity choose the audit standard to be audited against, or can it override the auditors? Now, I think it's important, if we have a clear answer about what this is, that the clear answer be within the authority section so that practitioners can point to this, because SMPs already see this as a risk. What they're saying is that if my policies and procedures prescribe that for this client, I have to use the ISAs, my firm says so, but the client says no. The client says, we think we're not complex. We think you should use the ISAs for LCE. And the client heard that it's going to be cheaper to use the other standard. The client will keep shopping around until they find an auditor to commit to use that standard at a lower effort and potentially a lower price. And in that process, us lose the overall debate about audit quality, because the audit quality is going to be reduced to a conversation that's only about the commercial considerations there. So I guess they're thinking ahead that if this comes along, how's it going to affect us? A minor comment on A2, read together with 2C. There is an example there that says, if you use this, it may not be sufficient for the auditor to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence. My view is that there won't be any circumstances where it would be sufficient. And I really would like the task group to have another look at that piece. The next one, and I think we've heard a few people say this already, I want to paint a broader picture about it, and this is the relationship between A5, A7, A9, and A10. Firstly, within A5, there's some confusion between the bullets, as the first bullet only describes an entity, whereas the second and third bullets describe matters or themes. All 3 bullets, in my view, should be pointing to entities. And the reason for that would be, one cannot exclude a topic from the scope of LCE. One can only exclude an entity that possesses that characteristic from the scope of the LCE. I think what we're trying to say, and I've given the task group several examples here, is that there's some people who would say that the diagram in 2C in some aspects is clearer than the text, because you see how they're connected. And when you read paragraph A, I think I heard Sachiko say that it would be useful if there was a closer connection between A5, A7, A9, and A10. And that's the point I'm making. So for example, if you read A7 alone, it would then, you then understand that to be, you simply can't use this blacklist, but you can use it for all others, which is not the case, of course, but there's no introduction paragraph within section A that describes that, describes that process. I did in the introductory remarks say, and I'm moving on to the next one, and that's about transitioning. Transitioning has not been addressed, as you have mentioned in the issues paper. I think that it's a significant issue, bordering on a fatal issue for me, in how the standard will be seen to operate on adoption and beyond. And I don't yet understand the task force's logic of why that is the case. We always consider transitional guidance when we issue standards, even though we may end up making changes in the body. Nothing prevents us from making body in the changes, but we've got to give some hint about how this will work both backwards and forwards, transitioning to the ISA for LCE and then transitioning backwards. Around the IAASB conversation we've had, I really like what Bev has said, and Bev used the words that this is a moving target. I think that that's the way I understood our May conversation. Yet I gathered from the issues paper that we were planning to stick with the IAASB language and not make any changes irrespective of the feedback they get. And I think that the 2 points are not reconcilable for me because the level of judgment in 2 clauses, particularly within the IAASB's definition, is such that it is going to make it extremely difficult to apply. And that's the flavor of the feedback that IAASB has received on their own consultation. So for example, if we describe certain functions as being the main functions, how is that going to be described in a consistent way between practitioners and firms? Is it less than a certain percentage, greater than a certain percentage? You know, we may wish to avoid this question already, but it's already coming up from a number of practitioners who've seen this draft. And what if the percentage varies from year to year? I appreciate that this is not an IAASB problem, but it will become our problem if we use the IAASB language as is. And I guess one way to deal with it is to be less final in our approach in the issues paper around this, to say that something we'll revisit when we see how IAASB settles on the feedback that they've been receiving. Around A10, and I guess we can link this to a number of things here, and I've heard some people say this already, and they use it generally in the context of judgment. I really would like to ask practitioners to put their hats on, their auditor hats on, and ask themselves that in respect of that long list of bullets in A10, at which point in the client process will you be able to answer these questions? If you have to apply these characteristics and come to an answer that says no, 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 no to all 9 of them, how much of audit work would you already have had to have done to come to a no answer? And I'm worried that when one does make this determination, and if it's expected to be done at the client acceptance stage, then will the auditor ever know enough about these risks to make this determination? This is a practically potentially fatal matter because it gives rise to some subsequent problems. Let me explain this. If A10 is going to drive the audit effort, the auditor will say later on in the audit, you know, I made some determination under section A, say for example, that the IT environment is not complex. And later on, as the audit is progressing, she realizes, oh, I've made a mistake. The IT environment is not simple, it is complex. What is she going to do then when she discovers it's moderate or complex? Will she have to change to the ISAs? And will she be able to do that? Because underlying this, there are major ethics and behavioral issues around it. Firstly, the stigma of having made the incorrect assessment. I told you, client, that I was going to use the LCE audit. And I assessed any one of these 9 categories as being less complex. Later on, it turned out that I was wrong. Guess what? You're going to have to pay more. This audit is going to take longer, and the stigma of having made the incorrect assessment. And I can't see easily how practitioners are going to turn around on this point. Secondly, the inconvenience of extending the procedures. Because when you read A10 in the context of 2C, you will need to do a lot of pre-engagement work and planning to make a fair determination, especially for all those risks that are marginal. I think that lastly, in A10, there is still much left to judgment. And there's a lot of words. If you highlight them, you realize that the words straightforward, pervasive, high degree, and complex appear like a dozen times in A10. And these are all terms that are subject to a range of interpretations. They'll differ by firm, and they'll differ by individual, and unfortunately, they will also differ by regulator. And they'll differ by how much experience a person has in the area. A person who has a lot of experience in an area may decide that this is not complex, or does not have a high degree of complexity, and therefore decide that this is an LCE audit, whereas another firm may describe it otherwise. And I really worry that we will crash around these issues in practice, particularly because we won't pass the test of a universally consistent one, knowing, as we now know, that you can arrive at very different conclusions using the same sets of facts and circumstances around the different characteristics in A10. There is, unfortunately, one solution. And that one solution is that whether A10 belongs at all in the standard or not, or whether the list in A7 is sufficient for our needs. Why this becomes relevant? A10 only prohibits usage for complex circumstances. But every one of us knows from our methodology, complexity exists on a spectrum. Complexity is on this end. Before that, we may have moderate complexity, and then we may have simple. We're only prohibiting over here the use when it's on the extreme end, and of course, that's subject to interpretation. What happens when we have a combination of moderate risks or a moderate risk? Could this result in a complex situation that would prohibit the standard from being applied? And I think we may need to reflect that just as a direct addition to A10, even if we decide not to remove it. So really concerned about the fatal issues here. I think once we nail this, and this is what we're spending a lot of time talking about, what comes after it will be proportionate to what we've decided in the authority section. The nature of the procedures will be applied because we know auditors know how to do those procedures. It's selecting the engagement that's going to be the critical issue here. Thank you.
Okay, conscious of time, Len?
Yeah, thank you, Tom. So my comments based on we are looking to issue the ED. So this is our final standard. So I'm broadly happy with the task force position, especially I think Bev and Kai explained about the PI definition, the characteristics. I think this is very important to agree with the task force approach, because there are 130 countries adopting ISAs, but we know that less than half of that adopts IAASB codes. That many jurisdictions don't have PI definitions. So I'm supportive of what you have landed, and perhaps in the explanatory memorandum to go up with something even more specific questions to deal with that issues. My other comments is about, there was a remark made by Kai in the opening about some people express that what we have here seems to be too negative. We want something more positive. I'm cautious about going down that path. I think we spent a lot of time drafting in our sections. And at this point that we have to draft something from a positive tone. Also, I'm conscious about we are acting as a role of a standard setter. We're not here as a professional body. I think it's important to uphold the reasonable assurance and public interest. I think I don't perceive what we have in there is anything negative. I think just a statement of facts. You know, this is our standards, and these are the entities that should not be used for LCE. So I don't see anything wrong about that. I do know in your issues paper, there's one reference group mentioned these comments. I don't know if other board member mentioned, but I'm actually just as happy with the language and tone we have in the preface. Thank you.
Thank you. That was the last hand up. I guess the IAASB question to me, I'm comfortable with the current state of play there, because I think my thought process is that IAASB defining those categories provided us with a group of entities that tend to be complex, and we thought it's better to align on their categories. Obviously, if we had felt that there was another category that should be included, we should do it. And certainly we'll be informed by their discussion as well. So I'd prefer to be as aligned as possible, but the bigger issue to me is whether we're removing complex entities. And what the original thrust of our discussion was to limit some judgment on this and to exclude more categories that shouldn't be at the edges of the LCE. So that's personally how I got my head around the categorization. And certainly I'm comfortable with a list with or without IAASB. I'd rather be aligned with IAASB, and I certainly will be informed by IAASB because maybe they will articulate a better group of categories going forward. But for now, I think it's not perfect, but that's, as based upon what we know today, one I'm comfortable getting feedback on. I also think that our proposal really reduces significant amount of judgment left to the firm after you get to the prohibitions, but then it allows further limitation at the end. And I understand Imran's point. The question is whether with some of the feedback that we've gotten through other people on this call and through your online comments, whether we could continue to clarify it to drive consistency of practice and the right incentives to get this right ultimately. But I take Imran's points, but I think we need to sort of see how the task force comes back to us a little bit, at least from my perspective, to see where it goes. I would regret removing all that paragraph 810, I have to say, because I think there could be further limitations about whether the LCE standard is applicable or not. But those were my two big themes. I think there's a lot of input that you've received on this section. I'm comfortable with the IAASB point right now, which is a big strategic question, and sort of keeping my eyes on this, but it's the best we know from the current point of today. Kai and Bev, that's my comment. It was not meant to be a board summary, but I wanted to let everyone speak before I had said anything.
Thank you. I think some of the questions we did get support for the direction we have, as you said as well, and as people have said in their comments, they have sent some written comments to the authority section. I think in the intro we said that we intend to potentially take back a part of the standard. The intention is that we as a task force will work on the authority section and provide you with an updated version of that so we can discuss on Wednesday session. So we will try to look at the authority section, see the comments that have come through, and we will present that to you, or that we can have a discussion about on Wednesday to try to accommodate that. I think just to respond to your comment, Len, with the positives, I think it's more about the benefits of using the standard and something that would go more into the supplemental guide, not specifically in the standard as such. So maybe that calms you your comment a bit as well. I think that's the impression we got, at least from a few board members as well as a reference group. I think there will be judgment in this decision. I think so we need to have that in mind. I think we need to try to balance the comments that we received. We will discuss, as I said, in task force tomorrow to see where we end up. Anything specific that you think we need further direction on that for this to move the discussion?
No, but I think we, as a task force, we will need to discuss the judgment piece, because obviously that's the piece that's still really we're getting lots of comments on, and how we can narrow that. So we will come back on that, obviously, in the turnaround that we'll bring for Wednesday. Thanks.
So by implication, by inference, I'll say that we are meeting. It was said as needed on Wednesday. It's needed on Wednesday. So, well, we may not require the whole 2 hours allocated, right? But we'll take as much of that time as required. So plan on joining on Wednesday afternoon. All right, Billy, note to the file on that one. Okay, is that anything else people want to raise, felt hasn't been aired on the authority section? Okay, we're 5 minutes over. I'm sorry that we've run over. Too important of a topic not to complete. I hope you feel it's been a robust discussion. If there are any points that need to be raised, obviously we'll come back on Wednesday, but please do so to Kai or Bev and team as soon as possible so they could react. Kai, any notes you want to let people know about the way forward before we close?
No, nothing specific. I think, as I said in the intro, we will continue running through the separate parts of the standard in this afternoon session, and remind people to send through written comments if they have not done so by 1 p.m. New York time today. So.
Okay, any comments from anyone else? Philly, you have anything to add? Okay, anything? Michael or Jim, we'll have plenty of opportunity to get you in tonight too as well, but if you have anything to say before we close?
I don't have anything in addition. I think this was a very productive morning.
Okay, thank you all for the great input. Always ping me if you have things that you want to be raised at the board meeting. Thanks for being open, honest, and candid with your feedback. I will see you at 5 p.m. East Coast time in the States. For those in Europe and South Africa, I hope you'll get some rest before that time. So you have lots of energy for this evening. And for those who have to wake up early in the morning to join us, I appreciate that as well. Speak to you shortly, and we'll reconvene this evening. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.